So thank you, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone both live via Zoom and watching this on YouTube to our penultimate session for our semester one History at Newcastle seminar series. So I would like to begin first, as usual, by acknowledging that at least those of us on campus in Callahan, are meeting on the traditional lands, unceded lands of the Pamalung clan of the Awabakal people, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to those elders wherever you may be meeting as well on those unceded lands. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Jan Lanicek from the University of New South Wales to give our speech today. So Jan is working is a historian of the history of the Holocaust and Jewish diaspora, and is currently working on a very interesting project on global Holocaust geography, and in particular Australia's place in that geography. And I believe this today's talk will feed into that. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Jan to the floor, who will be speaking about family and global history of the Holocaust.
Okay, thanks, Ryan, and thanks for inviting me. And I'm sorry I can't be there. So just to keep to time, this is a work in progress that on a project that I have with Professor Ruth Balint, funded by the Australian Research Council, and it's an attempt to offer slightly different perspective on Holocaust studies and include Australia in this global Holocaust geography. I will start with a quote from a novel published in 1946, so in 1 year after the end of the war, by Hersch Bergner, who was a Yiddish writer based in Melbourne, a Polish Jewish refugee. And he wrote a book, Between Sky and Sea, which depicts the story of a group of refugees going from Greece to Australia at the beginning of the war on this old, decrepit steamer. And they suffer from seasickness, but also from emerging personal trauma, and some of them commit suicide. There's one scene when Ida, when the female character, approaches her lover, Nathan, because he abandoned his wife and child back in Poland. And this is a quote. When he heard her words, Nathan stopped, bewildered at a loss. He felt helpless, and it seemed to him as though someone had undressed him and left him naked among strangers. He had tormented himself enough. All the sorrows and persecutions of his people who had stayed at home were deeply etched on his uneasy conscience. Why had he run away as a coward? How could he deserve better than his child? How could he deserve better than his wife, Feigele? So what Bergner identifies very early after the war is a darker side of migration stories that often end with the happy ending of refugees or migrants arriving in their new homelands and saving their lives. In fact, Bergner shows that family separation, often permanent family separation between those who came in Australia before the war and their family members who stayed behind and perished on the Holocaust, are also part of the history of the war, Holocaust, and refugees. And so the aim of this our project is to focus on stories, individual stories of Jewish refugees, and to demonstrate the global and long-term impact of genocidal violence, and focusing on this global, what we call global families that were created early in Nazi rule and that brought the trauma of persecution to distant parts of the world, and that this trauma survived for decades or for the rest of the lives of refugees and migrants even after the war. And I can use 3 examples to show this connection about global history. One is the role family networks played in the efforts of Jews to escape Nazi Europe before the war. The second one is the role family networks play in the transmission of information, so the connections during the war, and then the trauma that survived the war and troubled Jewish refugees, migrants after the end of the war. So the first one, just take a look at briefly at the issue of migration. Popular stories from the late 1930s among survivors after the war suggest that when the situation became really bad and the persecution increased, Jewish people who tried to escape often contacted their family members overseas, often distant cousins or uncles, asking for affidavits and other forms of visa guarantee. For example, Max Heitlinger, the man in the image, who came in 1939 from Vienna to Melbourne, mentioned in his memoirs that hundreds of people crowded into post offices to find in the telephone books the addresses of Americans with the same name so they could be approached for affidavits. Heitlinger himself sent 10 letters to people in New York saying that although they were not related, asking them if they could provide him with affidavit to get to the United States. In the end, he got a landing permit for Australia from his cousin who lived in Melbourne. So at the point when very long queues of prospective immigrants were lining in front of embassies and consulates, having a family member or friend overseas offered possibilities to jump the queue and even bypass strict immigration laws. Furthermore, this sponsorship by local residents offered opportunities to escape even to those who otherwise lacked necessary financial means, which was fundamental for migration, and in the case of Australia, allowed migration of national or cultural groups that were considered undesirable by the Australian government, for example, Eastern European Jews. For example, in March 1939, rumors circulated in Nazi-controlled Vienna that £50 and a friend, in quotation marks, in Australia were enough to get a landing permit. This was at the point when it became increasingly harder for Jews to get immigration visas elsewhere. So it's very hard to tell how widespread this phenomenon was. But my argument is that this sponsorship played quite a significant role in the global refugee crisis in case of Australia. We know that somewhere between 6,500 to 10,000 Jewish refugees, migrants, and detainees came to Australia before 1941, so during the Nazi rule, and several thousand of them came through family sponsorship, mostly obviously from Germany, including Austria, but also, as you can see from this statistic, also from Poland, for example, which is quite interesting case. I will tell more about that in a minute. So during the 1930s, Australia still adhered to White Australia policy and was very strictly controlling influx of racially and culturally undesirable migrants, mainly non-Europeans. In 1924, the Immigration Act introduced the need to possess landing permit and landing money. At the same time, the government introduced or created a scheme of granting landing permits to relatives and friends of Australian residents who were willing to sponsor them and guarantee their maintenance in Australia for eventually up to 5 years. And in this case, there was much less vetting, and the immigration officials were primarily concerned about the economic status of the sponsor and their suitability for guaranteeing that the nominee would not become a public charge. Especially in the case of dependent relatives, spouses, children, adult daughters of fiancés, the process was relatively easy. In comparison, in case of direct applicants without sponsorship, it was vetted much more in detail, including their cultural assimilability based on photos often, or job opportunities in Australia, and obviously the financial means they possessed. They needed £200, sponsored migrant only 50. so 1/4 of that. And these two main avenues became open until the outbreak of the war, although there were efforts by the Australian government to curtail the sponsorship channel that was, in their opinion, bringing undesirable migrants to Australia. And for example, as I have the quote from 1939, experience has shown that many refugees within a few weeks or months after they arrive seek permission to introduce their parents or other close relatives, such as brothers, brothers-in-law, and the respective families of such relatives. And they called it the snowball effect of immigration. We would call it chain migration today. And it raised many concerns in the government, including also in the established Anglo-Jewish community, because they didn't have any control over people who were coming through these channels, for example, from Poland. And an example on the right is a form that the so-called Form 40 that the guarantor, the sponsor in Australia, had to complete. So we have some availability of data to consult. Unfortunately, the files themselves did not survive, only the cover sheet, which is horrible and shocking and really disturbing for historians. So we can't really see how the application was processed. We can see from other sources a little bit, but not as much. So to give an example of how the sponsorship could help with the arrival of Jewish refugees or migrants before the war, let's consider a few case studies. So in October 1938, so about 9 months after the Anschluss of Austria, the annexation of Austria, Ernst Heller from Vienna applied for the admission together with his fiancée Gisela and her son Edgar Herbert. Ernst worked as a waiter in a coffee house, which was not the most beneficial employment for application, but promised to seek employment as a waiter, electrotechnical worker, butler, or chauffeur. He also possessed £200 of the landing money, but his application was rejected. We don't know why. Only a few weeks later, Charles or Carl Beck, who arrived in Australia only in November 1938, so recently, submitted the application for the admission of relatives and friends, and he's promised to sponsor 6 people, including Ernst and Gisela and Herbert, or Edgar Herbert, and another family of his second sister. Gisela was his sister. Now Gisela was listed as married to Ernst, and he intended to work in farming. So kind of promising employment for getting a permit for Australia. And also the husband of Annie, Hans, suddenly wanted to work as a farmer. And Beck, the sponsor, promised that they would buy a farm and kind of establish a business in Australia. It was approved, and both families arrived in July 1939, only a few weeks before the outbreak of the war. We don't know what kind of swayed the immigration official to approve the application in this case, but it's clear that the fact that Charles applied directly from Australia, that he knew what to write in the application, that they wrote the right employment in the application, but they never worked in farm industry after the arrival, and that they could apply directly from Sydney to Canberra, saved a lot of time, and allowed them to arrive before the outbreak of the war, at the time when people in Europe could wait for 4 or 5 months for the application to be even processed. Even more significant was this channel of family sponsorship in case of Polish Jews. And we know that the situation in Poland got very difficult in the late 1930s, even before the war. There was the economic boycotts, anti-Semitic violence, and persecution of the Jewish population, and also the approaching beginning of the war, or the approaching outbreak of the war, forced many to seek refuge overseas. And in the case of Australia, they could rely on about 2,000 Polish Jews who migrated here in 1926, 1928, and settled in Melbourne, or mostly in Melbourne, before also Australia tried to stop this migration following the US quota system in 1920, 1924. But about 2,000 Polish Jews already arrived. And in the following years, they used this channel of family sponsorship, excuse me, to invite their family members, starting with the spouses and children, eventually moving to more distant family members and friends. And as you can see from the slide, the effort increased quite dramatically in the late 1930s. Don't have to go through all the names, but you can see that there's arrival of couple in 1926 of Shimon and Tonya. And initially they invited their brothers, and then in the late 1930s successfully brought another 6 people just before the outbreak of the war. So the arrival of the couple in 1926 brought in total close to 9 people in Australia at the point when Polish Jews were seen as undesirable, culturally undesirable migrants, but the sponsorship channels helped to bring them here. Another example of the Kaplan family, which is interesting for another reason. Belleville, later Wolf, Kaplan arrived in 1928. Initially, he sponsored his wife, Simela, and 5 children. In the 1930s, he tried to bring more people in, and quite successfully, mentioning that conditions latterly have been very hard for them in Poland. But in 1936, he attempts to bring the family of his sister and her husband, Hersch Itzek Frosch, and his wife, Dvora, and 5 children. But this application was rejected because the police investigators concluded that Kaplan, the sponsor, was in poor health and his business was struggling through crisis. So he couldn't be regarded as a sound guarantor. Not giving up, Kaplan resubmitted the application, now only for Hersch Frosch, the bald man, the right upper corner. And this was approved because the police inspector suggested that little risk would be involved if only Frosch arrived, and after he successfully establishes himself, he can bring over the rest. So the breadwinner comes first, he creates some kind of economic background and invites the rest. So he arrived together with his oldest son, Henoch, tried to bring over the rest of the family, 4 children and wife, but they were not successful. They all perished in the Holocaust. So we can see that even this channel was not entirely successful, and we can see more similar examples of separated families being created through this sponsorship channel. A family of Majlok Ruda from Warsaw, a husband, wife, and 5 daughters. Always feel like for the man. And he arrives with 2 daughters in 1939 from Warsaw. His wife and 3 daughters stay back in Warsaw and perish in the Holocaust. Final example, Solomon Wallenstein, later Saul Wallen, and his wife, Faiga, had 2 daughters, Esther and Chaya. They are being sponsored to arrive in Australia. Initially, the sponsors want to kind of invite the whole family. Then they change their mind and decide that they would invite only the breadwinner and 1 daughter. And after they kind of establish themselves, they can invite the rest. So Saul arrived with Esther, but obviously then the war broke out and they can never reunite with the wife and the second sister, and they perish in the Holocaust. So interesting source for research in this case, which I never in my life imagined I would be researching when I studied the history in the Czech Republic many years ago, are, for example, tombstones in Australia, and the way how they kind of reunite imaginarily the families after the refugee passed away, and they at least put this little plaque at the bottom of the grave to kind of reuniting with their family members in this kind of emotional space after that, at least symbolically in this way. It's interesting source to work with. So there's Esther Ovis, Esther Wallenstein, and at the bottom of the tombstone or the grave, plaque in the memory of her mother and sister, who died in the Holocaust. So it's kind of interesting way how to look at these individual stories and to think about the global impact of the Holocaust in the sense of family migration and separated families that were kind of caused by the refugees escaping the Nazi regime, and to show how the Holocaust as a genocide had a global impact because it dispersed the people around the globe, but also they kept maintaining the connection either by postal connection or other ways, but also the emotional connection that could continue even after the war. If we go to the second topic, and I'm aware of time, about information. Once the war broke out, any kind of real connection and attempts to bring refugees over, although they continued until 1941, there are refugees still arriving until 1941, individuals, but mostly remain in terms of communication and attempts to establish communication with their family members and to find out about their situation and to kind of find out about what's happening in Nazi Germany. And obviously, once the war broke out, any direct connection between enemy territories was forbidden by the Trading with Enemy Act in Australia and from September 1939. But they still attempted to find a way how to reach their loved ones in Nazi Europe. And here, what we call the global families played an important role. Because not every single country in the world declared war. Many of them remained neutral for a long time. For example, Western Europe until summer 1940, the United States until December 1941, Latin America even longer. And being neutral meant that they could communicate with both sides of the conflict, meaning that they could also kind of connect as go-betweens, family members separated by the war. For example, Zygmunt Danziger, the man in the image, born in 1912 in Krakow, settled in Sydney in 1929 already, and he kept receiving information about his parents and his fiancée back in Krakow in Poland via a childhood friend who escaped to the Soviet Union and from there to Japan. So in 1941 he lived in Japan, but also from family contacts in Bolivia. Such communications obviously raised suspicion in the Australian police, especially if the letters were written in Polish or German. So it was not very wise to receive letters in German from Japan in the summer of 1941. And Danziger was repeatedly interrogated by the police in Sydney and had to explain the content of the letters he was receiving from Japan at the time. But he received them. Another even more interesting example possibly is Rose Londner, or Rose Breutmann. She left Hanover in Germany in June 1939. Her husband Willy, who was supposed to follow her, was detained by the Nazis and as a Polish citizen sent to Poland even before the war broke out. So he was supposed to follow her, but he could not. He was settled in eastern Poland near the town of Lublin. But Rose maintained contact with her mother in Germany and even with her husband in German-occupied Poland via intermediaries in the United States, the Netherlands, and Denmark for some time. Her husband Willy was sending letters from occupied Poland to his in-laws in Hanover. They sent the letters to either the Netherlands or the United States, and from there the letters continued to Australia. Obviously, this took very long time, but as you can see from the image, they were arriving. And Wilhelm even managed to share quite disturbing information about first massacres of the Jews in occupied Poland by the Nazis in early 1940. Also, he told Rose about his work in occupied Poland for the Jewish Social Self-Help Association, that was a humanitarian agency funded by the Joint Distribution Committee. So this communication continued until 1941, and they actually the letters kept arriving. The Australian government was trying to stop this illegal communication, because obviously even indirect communication with enemy territories was prohibited. And we can find some information about this cat and mouse game. And some of the refugees were caught and received fines from the court. As Ruth Enge, lady in the image, who was communicated with her mother in Frankfurt, but the letters were caught, and when the police discovered that letters sent to the United States were in fact intended for enemy territories, and she received £20 fine, which was a significant amount, and even the press was writing about her as the German who writes home. So it shows again the agency of Jewish refugees who are trying to kind of bypass these strict laws, but also the authorities trying to stop them from communicating with their loved ones in Europe. Yeah, really interesting case studies, and I will need to be more selective in what I'm now presenting because of time. I'm sure that many of you have heard about the Nira boys, the group of 2,500 enemy aliens, German Austrians, sent from Britain in the summer of 1940 to Australia for detention. 2,000 of them were Jewish refugees, and they had to live in hay or tatura camps in the hinterlands in New South Wales and Victoria, in internment camps for over a year, or should go to 2 years. But it's kind of ironic twist of history that the fact of being interned in Australia came with the rights given to prisoners of war. So Jewish refugees were treated as German prisoners of war, which meant that they could communicate with their family members in Germany. And those are quite long letters that some of them were sending and receiving. There's a collection of Henry or Heinz Lippmann, who left in 1939 at the age of 18 to Britain. He was detained and sent to Hay Camp in New South Wales. And he continued to communicate with his parents and younger brother Kurt in Berlin, all the way until April 1942, when they were deported to the Warsaw Ghetto. But even after they were deported, he received the information about their deportation, including their address in the Warsaw Ghetto, from family members in Europe, in Berlin, but also in London and in Sweden, I believe. So it's just interesting that Jewish prisoners of war were the only people in Australia who could actually communicate with their family members in Nazi Europe. Final example of this communication is that in 1940, the International Committee of the Red Cross established kind of this postal service of very short messages of 25 words each, which connected people in enemy territories and allow people to communicate with enemy territories. So this allowed also Jewish refugees in Australia and elsewhere to establish contact, a very brief contact with their family members in Nazi-occupied Europe. I have this example of Herman or Harry Geist, who arrived in 1939 from Poland, but his parents, Shimon and Freya, and sister Chaya, remained back in Nazi-occupied Poland. And Geist was able to communicate on several occasions with his parents and sister in occupied Poland via the Red Cross. And finally, however, the communication stopped soon, and the final message was returned to Geist with the message that the ominous words that his family members couldn't be located, and with the slogan Heil Hitler instead of signature. Now we know that at the time they were already murdered in the Chelmno extermination camp. But these messages kept arriving during 1941-42, even from very unlikely places. I'm still fascinated by this. Message that arrived in 1941 from the Warsaw Ghetto in in Sydney to Oxford Street. Message reads that, "Dear sisters, we together with mother are all healthy. If possible, quickly send underwear, clothing, food. Please write Eva, Max, Regina. Kisses from Zygmunt. Or we've seen the Ruda family before. In June 1942, Paula Ruda, also in Warsaw, sent a message to her sister in Melbourne, quote, "We are in dire material conditions. Mother lost her sight. We plead for any help as soon as possible. We all live together. We are waiting for help and the news. Regards." So I think it's interesting is that those are very brief messages, but they still kind of reveal a lot of information about what's happening. And if they are read alongside, for example, the press, which was conveying messages about the situation in occupied Poland, about the situation in the ghettos. So if they are read alongside, they kind of construct quite precise image about what's happening to the Jewish people at the time, and also show these very difficult material conditions they have to live in, and kind of try to move their family members to support them, to send them some support if possible, and to help them in their unfortunate flight. Obviously, these communications again took months to arrive. They were arriving, but these long breaks between arrival of messages only increased the trauma and this kind of feeling of powerlessness and helplessness for Jewish refugees in Poland, but also for their family members in occupied Europe or in Nazi Europe. There's a collection of letters from the Melbourne Holocaust Museum from an elderly mother to her son in Melbourne, which there's a kind of bunch of them, and you can see how the trauma and the kind of feeling of abandonment trickles through the letters when she's completely abandoned in Berlin and tries to communicate with her son, sometimes hearing from him, sometimes not. She also keeps communicating about the fact that very soon her deportation would come, that her friends are being deported already, then those who had been sent to Poland or elsewhere, that they never hear back from them, so they don't know what's happening. And in the final message, she basically tells him that she would be deported to Theresienstadt ghetto soon. So she even knew the location where she would be sent eventually. So again, I think it's interesting how detailed the information actually was shared in these letters or these messages. I mentioned Rose Breutmann before, so she communicated with her parents in Hanover and with her husband in Lublin with the help of these messages, and eventually she basically was able to find out about the death of her husband in Lublin in 1941. He died of disease, so he was not murdered in gas chambers, but he died, and her mother and stepfather informed her about the death, so that she knew already during the war that her husband died. On the other hand, she could inform them later in the war that she remarried and that they became grandparents. All still through the services of the Red Cross. So again, the communication and the connection continues. In this case, because her mother was married to a non-Jewish man, which protected her against deportation, it means that they could communicate for a very long time, all the way until 1944. Okay, so I want to actually make one final point on this topic, and then move on. Is that what I see as important is that those Jewish refugees who were communicating with their family members were not only passively receiving the information, but that they also tried to act upon receiving them. First, by trying to secure landing permits or immigration papers. When that became impossible, that at least to provide their family members with some material help in terms of money or some relief food parcels. But in this case, they again faced quite significant obstacles from the Australian government because of the Trading with the Enemy Act prohibited any shipment of money or shipment of any aid to Nazi-controlled territories, which the Nazis could use for their benefit or for whatever other reason. Also because the Allies believed that it was the obligation of the Germans to feed the population that lived under their occupation. Obviously, it's clear misunderstanding of the intentions behind Nazi policies. So I mentioned Danziger before, and after he failed to bring his family members over, in 1940, he approached the Federal Treasury, Australian Federal Treasury, with the request to send £5 a month to his father in occupied Poland, merely for the purpose of saving him from starvation. The request was rejected because of the Trading with the Enemy Act, which prohibited any transmission of funds to occupied Europe. Similarly, Moritz and Charlotte Heller from Lidcombe in New South Wales approached their local MP if they could secure permission to send food parcels to Moritz's parents deported to occupied Poland. They received the information from cousin in Bolivia, including the location in eastern Poland where they were deported. Again, this was rejected because of the Trading with the Enemy Act, and they were even warned by the government that if they tried to find a way around the prohibition, or the kind of ban on shipments, that they could be punished by the government for breaking the law. Although we note again that people that try to send money, for example, to Portugal or elsewhere, that they from there they could send food parcels to the ghettos. Eventually, in 1942, the British government made a kind of exception, and they allowed the shipment of several thousand food parcels from Lisbon to Jewish prisoners in ghettos from Lisbon. Those were mostly cans or tins with sardines. It was funded by Jewish organizations in Britain. And once the information spread, although it was supposed to be kind of confidential, but it reached Australia very soon. And very quickly, hundreds of Jewish refugees who lived in Australia began to approach the Board of Deputies in Britain with the request that also their family members were included in the shipments of food from Lisbon, and they provided the addresses of their family members in occupied Poland, up-to-date addresses for those shipments, which again shows that they possessed quite significant amount of information about the whereabouts of their loved ones so late in the war in 1942, 1943. Most of the parcels could not be delivered for the reasons that the ghettos had been liquidated before that. But there is some anecdotal evidence that at least some of the parcels arrived in the ghettos, and that also some of the people who were put onto the lists by Australian refugees in Australia were among the recipients of the aid. So you can see that the information was flowing, and that they acted upon the information and tried to help in this way. Although clearly the feeling of helplessness prevailed eventually when the silence continued and they could not receive more information, but the newspapers kept bringing more information about the situation. And they felt like the trauma is the final point that became part of the life of refugees. The trauma of survival and the trauma of being unable to help their loved ones at this very critical point of time. Again, Max Heitlinger, in his memoirs, wrote, "I still wake up at night and cry in desperation and self-accusation. Why, for heaven's sake, did I not send them parcels every week or every second day to make their lives more bearable? Why? This cry to heaven will haunt me to the last day of my life." And this kind of connects me to the final point of talk, and I'm aware of the time that I need to finish in about 5 minutes, so to have some time for questions, for discussion. So I will go very briefly and just make a few comments about the issue of trauma. And it's an interesting topic to discuss, and it's a little bit outside of my comfort zone because I'm a historian and now going more into field of kind of psychology, at least briefly as a social historian, and I still don't feel entirely comfortable in that area. But I think there's a lot of potential. A lot has been written on survivor guilt in terms of people who survived the camps or ghettos or any other types of mass violence, and that's kind of established field. Much less is known about refugees and how refugees suffer from the survival guilt and of the feeling of that they survive at the expense of others and that they survived in kind of the safety, in this case of Australia, while their spouses, parents, or other family members or communities went through all this hell of ghettos, persecution, and extermination camps. And already during the war, some of the refugees identified this trauma in their communications. I have the letter from Irene. We don't know the surname in this case. A refugee in London during the war. And in January 1942, she sent a message to Max and Nelly Heitlinger, again, going back to Heitlinger. And she wrote that, unfortunately, we all suffered something. And even if we are actually doing better than we expected, it is the fate of the family that does not allow us to be happy. I always have great concern for my dear father. The fear of him being sent to Poland always hovers in front of my eyes like a sword of Damocles, but like all of you, I'm as helpless and powerless. All of this had a major impact on my health. I developed a nervous stomach, lost weight so rapidly that I told myself all sorts of things, and I recently had an X-ray, but they found, thank God, nothing. But we know that this trauma continued to haunt the refugees for the rest of their lives, and we know that from oral history recorded in 1980s, 1990s, when they often find it very difficult to talk about the family separation and the fact that they survived while their parents, spouses, and children perished. So I, for example, will go very briefly, use this story of Heinz Lippmann, and his oral testimony is very interesting because he really finds it increasingly difficult to talk about the family separation and about the fate of his parents and in occupied, he was German, so in Germany, which leads him eventually to the conclusion that he actually is a survivor, that despite the fact that he didn't go through the war, he didn't go through the Holocaust or the main phase of the Holocaust, that still the fact that he's the only one from his family to survive made him into survivor. He constantly cries through the interview and finds it very, very hard to talk about it. Another interesting way how to approach the issue of trauma is with the third generation writing, which I've been doing recently. There's been boom in third generation, so the grandchildren of the victims of the war, to write about their families, to these kind of journeys in the search of the past, learning more about the family because their parents couldn't talk about it, and trying to understand the behavior of their parents as Holocaust survivors, or in this case, as refugees from Nazi Germany. So to conclude, there's this book by Bernard Marin about his father, Stan, or Stanislav, who came before the war from Poland. And they had very difficult personal connection and relations, Stan and Bernard. After Stan died, Bernard was suffering from very severe headaches, so he kind of talked to a psychologist about that. He talks about the very difficult relations with his father, and he called his father, and I quote, so I apologize, he calls his father a cunt, a fucking bastard in the book. But then he starts to search for the kind of the reasons why his father behaved as he behaved. And he finds out that he arrived in 1937 in Australia from Poland as the only one from his family at the age of 16 or 17. His parents, sister, and brother stayed behind. And shortly after he departed, his father committed suicide for economic reasons, but the rest of the family, apart from his own, perished in the Holocaust. And that affected him so deeply, mentally and physically, that he had such a very difficult relation with his son. And Bernard concludes in this book, it's strange, I guess he wasn't really a survivor because he wasn't there, but he lost more than most people ever do, almost everything he knew as a child, all his family in one way or another. But he was saved. I can't imagine how that must feel. Psychologists, they write about the feeling of being undeserved beneficiary, the feeling of refugees, which also apply for this case, because initially it was his older brother, Broniek, who was supposed to come. He changed his mind. So instead of him, Stanislav or Stanley arrived. So he wasn't even supposed to arrive, which again only emphasized the trauma. So I will stop here. I have much more I could say, but I know that we are out of time. So these are really the three topics that I was trying to introduce: the migration, the information flow, and the trauma as a way to construct this global long-term history of the Holocaust. I hope it did make at least a little bit of sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that wonderful and enlightening paper. Yeah, very sobering and very illustrative of the extent of the tragedy and its global reach, including in our own backyard that we probably don't think of often enough. I'm happy to. We have 5 minutes or so for questions, so I'm happy to open it up to the floor. Yes, Sash.
I might jump in. Thank you, Jan. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm wondering if you've had a look at attempts at family reunion after the Holocaust, and I'm wondering whether you're seeing similar patterns in terms of the kinds of strategies people are using to try and achieve reunification with the survivors, and also whether the Cold War is it adds another level of complication to that process of family reunion.
Okay. No, thanks, Sasha, for that. Yes, that's a really important topic. Ruth Balin would know more about it, but there were many attempts at family reunion. We, for example, have letters that arrive from Buchenwald or from Belsen, sent by US or British soldiers, kind of to Australia from. So I have a family that, again, father came with two sons, and the mother and three sons stayed behind. And then in May 1945, letter comes from Buchenwald, from one of the sons to his father, who is in Melbourne, saying, well, I survived. And then he brings him over. They managed to bring them over. And we know that initially the Australian government, they supported reunions in 1945-46. When it became when the press began to write about too many Jews arriving, they tried to curtail it. But even after the war, the family reunion becomes, the sponsorship becomes one of the main ways, one of the ways to arrive. Also from then there's the IRO and DP scheme that Ruth Balin wrote about that. So there's definitely we know that the relation was not the easiest after the reunion of the families. So we did some interviews with, again, that's the second, third generation, depending how you consider it. And they say that, for example, one lady was talking about her father and that his family, perhaps the feeling of guilt, treating them very badly after the war. And it was very difficult to have the kind of connection with the family, with his brothers and his father after the war, because of feeling of trauma, guilt, or for whatever other reason. So that's an interesting topic, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Julie, I saw your fingers moving. I'm not sure if it's auctioneer, if you have a question.
Okay, so I didn't have one formulated, but I'm happy to ask Jana to talk about his project some more. This is outside of my research area. I guess what popped into my head was curious about how your work is in any way connected with what Jane Persian has done in the past. Um, I'm a little bit familiar with her work, but is there a connection there at all? Is this kind of building on that work, or is it intersecting with it at all?
No, thank you. I mean, Jane wrote about displaced persons after the war, so after 1945, and from memory, I think she mostly focused on non-Jewish DPs, mostly from the Baltic states and the kind of these refugees from communism. I must say I would have to revisit her book more in detail. It's definitely aligned with Ruth Balin's book. Ruth Balin's a book on displaced persons, and Ruth is doing now more on family as well after the war. So what I do more, I kind of once I get past 47, I begin to lose interest in a little bit. I kind of am more before that. And Ruth goes more into the 1950s. So in our project, she's more the post-war, I'm more the pre-war wartime.
Mm.
Although clearly it can be separated in that way. So it is definitely building on Jane's or Sheila Fitzpatrick's work, Susan Ratland's work, definitely, yes.
And I just a follow-up then. Are you finding that method of thinking about subsequent generations and perhaps that's particularly relevant for you, is that proving to be but both kind of challenging and fruitful? Because it sounds like that's very much a cornerstone of what you're doing.
Yeah, no, it is challenging, and partly methodologically, I would say it goes a bit outside of history. It goes more just like social studies sometimes, like psychology, and it is challenging. But I mean, sometimes I guess you need to challenge yourself a little bit to think about it. So it can be rewarding. I was always a bit skeptical about the value of oral history for like a traditional history. Unfortunately, for most of the people who came before the war, there are not many records in terms of memoir or oral history, partly because they didn't consider themselves survivors that much, and partly because the main oral history projects came in the 1990s when many of them were not alive anymore or they were too old to kind of leave these records. So the second generation and third generation is a way then to approach it as a way. So yeah, I mean, I find it challenging, but also rewarding if you have ability to cross-check the information with other sources. Unfortunately, possibly with the issue of trauma, you can work more in this case because that's kind of personal, and it's not kind of hard history facts that you would kind of would like to cross-check with official documentation. So for the final part about trauma, that definitely there's a lot of potential, I would say, to discuss. Although, again, it's very, for ethical reasons, it raises other issues.
All right. Well, thank you, Jan. We might wrap it up there. And please join me in one more round of applause and thanks for joining us. Just a reminder of our final session a week from today, next Friday, the 17th of April, we will have Dr. Heather Lyle talking to us about malaria at home, gendered encounters with malarial disease in domestic settings on Australia's tropical frontier. And we'll be returning to our traditional hybrid format as well. So if you're on campus and can join us at the Moody Library in L326, that would be fantastic. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me.